Hello and welcome to NDP, your eye on the Yukon. I'm Gordon Loverin. The Tatshenshini Park forms part of the world's largest heritage site created by the United Nations. Located in the far northern reaches of British Columbia, it forms part of the traditional territory of the Yukon's Champagne and Aishihik First Nation. During the last decade, the creation of the park brought together some unlikely allies. Still, Aboriginal peoples, environmentalists, and miners all had different ideas of what should happen in the region. The BC government promised to properly recognize Aboriginal rights in the park. Today, the Champagne and Aishihik First Nation are wondering when that will happen. Or will the park become today's version of glass beads and shiny trinkets?
In our discussions with land claims, we always assumed that we could still claim areas of the park.
And I recall that they had some activities in the Tatshenshini area.
This had the potential to be one of the most dangerous mining proposals ever advanced in North America.
Canadians will not directly benefit in the way they once might have from the wealth that was on Canadian soil.
The Tatshenshini Park was born out of conflict, a tug of war of opposing ideals between the mining and tourism industries.
This is truly one of the most spectacular wilderness areas in the world. And we in British Columbia must live up to our global responsibilities to keep it that way. To achieve that goal, I'm announcing today that the entire Tatshenshini area will be permanently protected as a Class A provincial park.
It's all gone. What are you going to get for this? Who's going to pay? What are you going to get out of a wilderness area? 1,000 people a year go up there. Who are these people? They're rich Americans.
Tatshenshini is North America's wildest river. We've just completed the largest international parkland in the world.
Saving the environment won out over building a new mine. But was that really all there was to it? Since 1992, the BC government has been involved in treaty making with First Nations. Was the creation of this park more about keeping a non-resident First Nation from claiming BC land?
Well, I had that feeling that something like that was coming about.
For almost 2 decades, Paul Burkle led the Champagne Aishihik First Nation.
Any messages?
Today, he now heads up their development company, and he says the park was a way to put a foothold on land they say is theirs in BC.
I could feel it, that, you know, we were being sort of pushed into this and sort of been left out, but we felt that, I think at the time, that we either have some control of whether we have a park or we lose everything, and basically that sort of got us to sign a parks agreement for the area, because at least we'd have some control and some say what happens to the area, and it's part of our traditional territory.
We're going to do great things because we now have the opportunity to do it ourselves, to do it our way, and to make our own mistakes.
Was signing a park agreement with the BC government a mistake? The First Nation recently walked away from the BC treaty table. They were only offered 20 square miles of land, no cash, and no self-government authority in their traditional territory. Burkle feels they should have been offered something more.
If they could offer the BC First Nations what they offered down south, then they should have at least honored the same kind of an agreement up here, because regardless of whether we live in the Yukon, it's still part of our traditional area, and we've been there way before they made any borders.
Most of the activities were not in the British Columbia side. Most of their activities took place further to the north, but that there would be a discussion of some of their minor activities in this territory.
Well, how about that?
Mike Harcourt doesn't run BC anymore, but he does wear the Tatshenshini Park as a badge of honor. A decision he says he has no regrets over.
So to create the largest international park and wilderness area in the world, larger even than the one in South Africa and Zimbabwe in Kruger National Park, I think was the right decision.
A move, it seems, which may have locked out one of the Yukon's largest First Nation language groups. The Southern Tatshenshini have occupied this region of North America for as long as they can remember.
We have relatives in Alaska, we have relatives in BC, and we have relatives in the Yukon, and before those boundaries were put in, we were all one part of a family because there's intermarriage and language going on.
Science, though, may be able to paint a much clearer picture of when the Southern Tatshenshini settled in the region. Archaeologists have uncovered artifacts revealing ancient hunters harvested caribou and bison using technology at least 7,000 years old.
This type of point just tends to be in that range.
A more recent event, a huge volcano, may shed more light on human occupation of the region. Almost 1,100 years ago, Mount Bona in Alaska exploded with such force that it made most of the southern Yukon uninhabitable. In some places, more than 6 feet of ash covered the ground. The Tatshenshini Alsac Basin, however, remained mostly untouched, and it's a story which forms part of the Southern Tatshenshini oral history. But the discovery which may give them their strongest evidence of this region being their homeland is this one.
And now the latest in local and regional news from the CAFN newsroom. Good morning, I'm Mark Johnston. A body believed to be a prehistoric First Nations hunter has been discovered in an ice field near the Tatshenshini Wilderness Park by 3 sheep hunters from British Columbia. Archaeologists have removed the remains of a man, plus hunting weapons and a cedar-woven hat. The body has been taken to an atmospherically controlled locker under the care of Renewable Resources. Renowned forensic anthropologist Owen Beattie has been brought in to examine and help determine how old the icebound hunter may be.
The other interesting factor, I think, in some of this is some of the very tools and the implements that this person was wearing is displayed right here on the table and around the windows here in Champagne-Aishihik offices right now. We have some of the wands, we have the throwing stick here right now. We have an example of that our people recently have been using. So we're still utilizing these tools in a variety of ways.
Today, the Southern Tatshenshini mostly live in Haines Junction, 100 miles west of Whitehorse. Other settlements include Champagne, Canyon Creek, Cluckshoe, Neskadaheen, and several summer camps in the BC and Yukon region. Yet, despite overwhelming evidence of occupation of the Tatshenshini Alsac Basin, Harcourt says the Champagne-Aishihik land claim in BC wasn't part of his equation.
Well, they're long-term partial use and occupation. Most of the activities of Champagne-Aishihik take place further north. Most of the community settlements are in the Yukon. And the use was for some hunting and fishing and some trade routes. So it's not a settlement use, it's a, from what I recollect, that's the usage that I remember. And the two are separate.
Just how separate may have been decided by Harcourt's cabinet advisors back in 1993. An inter-cabinet source of the day says Harcourt was given a simple strategy: create the park, offer co-management of it to the Champagne-Aishihik First Nation, and when it came to their trans-boundary treaty talks, BC would offer nothing.
Do you recall those discussions?
I don't. I recall having discussions with Champagne-Aishihik. And I recall that they had had some activities in the Tatshenshini area.
It seems the province kept to its secret agenda all along, forcing the Champagne-Aishihik First Nation into making the first move.
Yes, they've suspended discussions with them, and because we were getting nowhere, they have not offered us anything. It started out as an offer of 20 square miles and to be on the east side of the Haynes Road, a small section, and no money, no self-government, nothing else. So it was a very disappointing offer to us.
The legacy of Mike Harcourt's park may still frustrate the Champagne Aishihik First Nation and their BC Treaty hopes. But here's what he did for the world. With a stroke of the pen, the former premier took away almost 1 million hectares of BC land from any kind of industrial development. In return, he created a safe haven for one of North America's greatest giants, the grizzly bear.
This is one of the densest areas of grizzly concentration in the province, or really anywhere in the world. There are really two kinds of bears. The main one that's here is the grizzly bear, and the other one is black bear, and there are two colors of black bear, the ones that are black and a really special one in this part of the world called the glacier bear that actually has a blue tinge to its coat. Its cousin down further south in British Columbia, the coyote, is white.
The park protects a unique system of predators and prey. These Dall sheep represent about half of the province's known populations. High in these mountains, they stand a chance of escaping the deadly jaws of a hungry grizzly bear.
There's a lot of really interesting wildlife. You can always view goats all the way down with the river. We're viewing goats along those creek canyons, and they're really quite close as you're going down.
The Tatshenshini Park also contains some of the continent's youngest mountains. The St. Elias Range includes Mount Fairweather. At just over 4,600 meters, it is the highest peak in British Columbia.
Oh, this is just a terrific wilderness area. The connection between the dry interior and going right out to the coast through the really formidable coastal mountains. There are very few places that rivers are able to do that. From the biological point of view, I'm a biologist, and I love to see the natural history of the area.
But what may mark this region's beauty and its place as a World Heritage Site are the glaciers. There are more than 350 valley glaciers and about 31 surge-type glaciers. These are ice bodies that have been known to spring forward as much as half a mile without warning. The Tatshenshini Park joins a host of other parks in the Yukon and Alaska to form the largest protected space in the world. But some would argue that Mike Harcourt only managed to give up sovereignty to a region worth billions to Canada.
If I wanted to develop the Windy Craggy deposit, where would I make an application? To whom?
Mary Webster was the exploration manager at the Windy Craggy site back in 1993. Today, she says, even if Canadians could mine the $16 billion worth of copper, who would give them their permits?
I cannot make it to the BC government. They don't govern there. The First Nations don't govern there. The federal government of Canada doesn't govern there. So my only speculation would be to make some kind of appeal to the United Nations.
Webster explains now that the Tatshenshini Park is part of a World Heritage Site, all North American parties have forfeited sovereignty of the region. She says Harcourt's actions have rendered all Canadians and First Nations powerless in their own backyard.
We fought for sovereignty of this country, and First Nations this is ongoing debate of sovereignty, and then to sweep away with several political decisions without public debate, without public forum. I think that's a very serious thing.
Well, what are you hearing about Dimet now?
More than $50 million was spent on exploration and pre-mine development costs. The company's payoff would have been access to more than $16 billion of copper, gold, cobalt, and silver.
Windy Craggy is a superstar amongst mining deposits of the world. Windy Craggy is the largest known Western world source of cobalt.
Geddes Resources was also backed by pension funds, important money managers, and major mining companies. The huge financial backing propelled Geddes Resources straight out of junior mining status.
It was astronomical. The street was anxious. Geddes Resources did a flow-through financing that was fully subscribed. It was an exciting time for the company.
But then Geddes Resources hit a wall of opposition from the environmentalists.
What we did at Tatshenshini was to try and get the message out as to what was at stake and what the threats were. And to do this, we recognized that we needed to build linkages and alliances throughout Canada and throughout North America.
So now we're making the final descent.
Until 1987, Rick Careless had never even heard of the Tatshenshini River. But he kept getting a call to float down it from Johnny Mikes, owner-operator of a river rafting tour company. To sweeten the pot, the trip was even offered for free.
So when I first went down the river in 1989 and saw the grandeur of this place, and then learned that there was the potential that a particularly dangerous mine could be developed here, I got really concerned about it. And I think it was a very personal experience of realizing that there was something very, very beautiful that was at stake.
Careless enlisted the help of over 50 North American environmental groups to battle with Geddes Resources over the river. Later, he would write that it was a major public offensive, a marketing effort.
This was never a viable mine, in my opinion. It was an extremely dangerous deposit. If that mountain had been opened up to mining, the sulfides, 40% content in the ore, would have combined with water vapor and oxygen in the atmosphere to create vast amounts of sulfuric acid.
For Careless and the river rafting companies, selling the threat of acid rock drainage was central to their cause. North Americans were led to believe one mine would destroy an entire river system.
That would have gotten into the bedrock, leached out heavy metals, and had the potential, and this is according to scientists in both Canada and the United States, to kill life in that river system for 10,000 years.
Only 10,000 years? Would that include the plants, trees, insects, which themselves help sustain the grizzly bear, sheep, goat, and the several species of birds?
And that's the willingness to use misinformation and the willingness to use scare tactics through the media in order to whip up public concern and public sentiment.
Patrick Moore co-founded Greenpeace, the largest environmental group in the world. He's no longer involved because he says the movement isn't what it used to be. He now works with the BC Forest Alliance as a spokesperson for the industry. He says the Windy Craigie mine development wasn't everything Rick Careless and company claimed it would be.
And to me, that's been a very unfortunate evolution in the environmental movement, that they have gone from basing their policies squarely on science and logic and reason and truth and justice and all those good things, to basing a lot of their policies on scare tactics and on misinformation and even just plain untruth in many cases.
Well, from a geological perspective, to me that's a very simple answer, and it was one thing that was never really highlighted, and that was that Windy Craigie sits in limestone. It actually sits in the neutralizing rock formation.
The other thing is, though, is that the copper deposit at Windy Craigie is 30 miles from the Tatshenshini River, and the environmental movement gave the impression that this huge open pit mine was going to be right alongside the river and that people would have to look at it as they went downstream. In fact, the only thing that people would ever have had to look at least in the proposal, was a bridge going over the river, which might have an ore truck on it if you happened to be there at the time one was going over.
I think the industry at large is still of the view that they can't believe it. This is Canada, and there's been this taking a non-public, just political decision, ad hoc, across the board to create a wonderful park. And the other is that it's simply gone. There's no way to recover it.
For the mining industry, losing access to the Windy Craigie deposit meant losing an income for a possible 2,000 people. For Careless, the TAT campaign would help support his own financial earning power. 4 years later, he would write and sell a book about his exploits and how to win similar causes. 2,500 copies were printed with a price tag of $18.95 per copy. Today, Careless and the river rafting companies are the only ones making an income from the Tatshenshini River.
I have experienced a huge sacrifice financially because I could have made money far, far more than anything you make as an environmental campaigner.
Let's just stay on the Tatshenshini.
That's right. There were times when we were eking out, wondering whether we were just straight going to run out of money.
You just can't trust these river guides. You know?
I have no security net that people who work in a company might expect.
It's kind of like there's the Alsac ale and here's the Tatshenshini ale. They all come together in one great big brew, yeah. And there's the ice to put in the drinks.
Yeah, well, we got the whole thing right here.
No pensions plans or none of the sick pay benefits or whatever. Working as an environmental campaigner, and I believe I'm working for people who aren't even alive yet. I'm working with very high risk economically.
Where is it different?
From a physical health point of view, it was extremely tough. I think maybe I made my first $50 in royalties off the book. You don't make any money writing books.
173 change.
I'll let you know how much you do.
There you go. Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
We, the people that live here and work out of this area, didn't really have a say-so in it at all. It was ruled and regulated when it was made a park by outside people.
Lance Goodwin's family have made the Tatshenshini River their home and income base for almost 40 years. He traps in winter and has 2 cabins inside the park boundary, one near the Tatshenshini headwaters and another at the lower end of the river. He says eco-tour operators haven't all been great for the region.
When the river was first being saved, as you say, the smaller groups were quite heavily impacting the river. There was a lot of small groups rafting it steady, and there was a huge number of people. And I think that the impact of that alone, saving the river, was probably more detrimental than if they hadn't been there, definitely. And yeah, they made a hell of a mess.
The rules that are in place here for rafting and river travelers are quite strict.
Gordon McCree is one of only 2 wardens who manage the Tatshenshini Alsac Provincial Park. He says rafters are expected to follow rules.
They're basically no trace camping, but it's carried to quite a high degree. You have to pack out your human excrement. There's special systems made for that. You cannot have a fire on the ground. You have to have a fire pan with you. And you are supposed to burn your organic waste, that kind of thing, and pack out your garbage. Basically, the site has to look as if no one was there when you leave.
I don't know how many hours I've spent cleaning up campsites when the rafting communities were going through. Not so much now, but it still happens. And cleaning out driftwood piles like high water, because rafts dump over in the canyon and they lose all their gear. Well, where does all that gear go? It's strewn up and down every log jam and gravel bar along the river.
Today, river rafting generates almost $2 million per year. There's little evidence that money stays local. Most companies are southern owned. For the Champagne-Aishihik First Nation, their park management agreement has only resulted in one job, half of the year.
It's not very much for what we gave up, and I don't think that it was very fair of the BC government, and they might have, as part of the strategy maybe, to isolate us from the area. They wanted the park, I guess, fairly bad, I guess, because there was a lot of pressure from a lot of groups.
Could one of those groups have been the BC government's Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs? The Champagne-Aishihik First Nation was on the verge of settling their land claim in the Yukon. It was a deal that would give them land, cash, and sweeping self-government powers. A land claim this good couldn't be allowed to cross over into BC.
People that worked for the BC government at that time were actually people that were actually from the Yukon that moved down south when the government changed up here. There was a good number of them went out to BC, and I think they convinced, to this day I still believe that they convinced the BC government that we had more than enough land and more than enough money and all those things, and not to give us anything.
No, I don't recall that being a central part of our discussions at all. You know, what we were trying to do was to open up treaty negotiations, not close them down. At least that was my intention as Premier.
Government and Aboriginal leaders agreed to create an independent treaty commission to oversee the negotiating process.
So the whole thrust of our government was to open up dialogue, to reach modern agreements, to work with Aboriginal people to get rid of the welfare reserves.
We've heard people from the inside of it told us that you know, our biggest enemy was actually the Yukoners that were there working for the BC government at that time.
The standoff between the mining industry and the environmentalists may have aided Mike Harcourt's government. Mining projects usually take 3 years to get permitted for production. The Windy Craigie fight was decided in only 18 months. Harcourt even ignored a public consultation recommendation from an agency of his own government's creation.
Well, we didn't disregard it. We just decided that it was time to make a decision. That's what government's all about.
The park decision was made by Cabinet on May 19, 1993, 10 days before the Champagne-Aishihik First Nation would sign their Yukon land claim final agreement. The Tatshenshini River Park announcement would be made public a month later.
They never told us anything close to that that's what they were going to do. They still strung us along and saying that they would have treaty negotiations and they would give us a fair deal, and that's what we were working on, but very surprised that they said that. I'm sure still, I guess, angers me to find out that that's what was their strategy.
You know, they signed off on the park on an NDP government. Will the NDP government now be kind and try and maybe reach an agreement with them that means something to the Champagne-Aishihik?
Well, we are trying, as you know, and you said they walked away, and I don't know who walked away. The fact is that they're not talking. We're not talking to each other on this particular issue, and I think we should be. But I'm not going to make any specific promises to you. The Premier doesn't negotiate, either on television or with people. There's a negotiating table, and if somebody can tell me that we need to make some changes or we need to provide more resources, we will do so to make sure that treaty tables move.
Today, the Champagne-Aishihik First Nation are determined to get a fair treaty deal with the BC government. Miners still cling to the hope of changing the park designation to allow mining. Both may get help from a man over 5 centuries old.
The Iceman, I think, will sort of be playing a role for us in proving our point that we were there from time immemorial, I guess, in terms of it, and we should be able to look at getting a better deal from them, hopefully.
For NADA, I'm Gordon Loverin.
Wait.
It's a ceremony?
And Your Majesty may be pleased to know that this year, thanks to the help of our Indian friends, we have produced some 30,000 pounds of this sweet gift.
Traditional knowledge is a growing buzzword among wildlife managers around the world. They talk about putting more and more of it into government wildlife management programs. In the Yukon, traditional knowledge is getting used by government biologists, thanks largely in part to the signing of modern-day treaties.
Scientists focus on a tiny part of nature and bring it into the laboratory, and they learn a lot about that little part of nature. But we have no idea what happens when you try to expand that out in the real world.
The term traditional knowledge is not, doesn't sit well. It's the holistic approach to what you actually go out and do.
If my conclusions differ with local and traditional knowledge, boy, I'm pretty worried that I missed the boat somewhere along the line.
What science really does, basically, is prove that most of our current hypotheses are wrong, and we modify them as we go along.
Yeah, we're not really interested in getting a new bear today, but if we find him in a good spot, then it might take a couple minutes longer than usual. I don't want to pre-mix any drugs.
For most of this century, wildlife biologists have used high-tech methods to study animals, using science to understand the world around them.
Yeah, she's stained up pretty good. Looks like about probably 2 years old there, Al.
Numbers and animals, lines of surveys and animals, graphs plotting growth trends of animal populations. For many wildlife biologists, this was how they viewed their work. If you can't plot it, you can't manage the environment. Some say the trouble with Western science is its limitations. It's expensive. It's reactive. Science studies nature only when a problem has been identified, and science can only capture snapshots of what it's looking for.
That's not to say it's useless. It's extremely useful. It is much more useful if you can combine it with that knowledge of long-term trends, that knowledge of the way things were and the way animals acted that comes out of people who have lived on the land for eons. The combination of the two makes a very powerful tool.
Jerry Couture is the outgoing chair of the Yukon Fish and Wildlife Management Board. 12 people, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, act as the primary caretakers of the territory's rich ecosystems. Set up under a land claim agreement, one of its guiding principles is to use the knowledge and experience gained by Yukon First Nations to carry out its work.
We've not arrived at the point where that complete integration is done, but definitely the board today, when it considers a management question, always asks, what's the traditional knowledge on this question and what's the solution?
We live in a world that's fast and demands definitions for new ideas. It's hard to relate to those who have simply lived as part of the natural world, like these Yukon First Nation elders. They have a special bond that only others who have lived the same way can relate to.
You don't see them in their environment and you haven't experienced what they experience. And a lot of the things they communicate, it's a paradox, are beyond words. You have to feel it. And as soon as people start talking the way I'm talking, other people say, uh-oh, he's lost it, you know. This is getting too far out there. I can't accept that stuff.
Doug Urquhart is one of the members of the Yukon Fish and Wildlife Management Board.
We had this traditional knowledge conference last April, and we tried to show as many as possible that we're even just in the emergent stage, so it's early days yet. And some of these things happen, for me, the exciting part is some of these happen and almost nobody notices them, and I'm kind of hoping that that's part of the acceptance route we're going on.
For Yukon First Nations, traditional knowledge was a matter of survival. If you didn't know where and when to harvest fish and wildlife, you could die. It was that simple. There were no supermarkets to go and buy your winter's food. As a culture based upon hunting and gathering, knowing how the seasons affected the animals around you was just as important as harvesting them. As a user of fish and game, Yukon First Nations developed a knowledge base spanning thousands of years. Knowledge which allowed them to feed, clothe, house, and make tools using the entire animals upon which they existed. In the Yukon, turning back the hands of time through traditional knowledge may very well change the way this territory develops in the future.
Our history is on the land and tied to the land, and any research projects that are initiated, in my experience, always involve the community.
You sit there and you scratch your head. It's what you do anyways, all the time. So putting the term TK on there, and people now have shortened it to that, TK or TEK, and it's hard to grasp plugging it into one little tiny word when it's such much more broader than that.
Managing Yukon fish and wildlife is a much harder task in these modern times. Technology has increased man's success. Let's face it, it's easier to bag a moose than it was 50 years ago. Protecting prime moose habitat from hunting pressure has forged a unique partnership in the heart of the Yukon. Lawrence Patterson is a Nacho-Nayakdun First Nation member. He's been working with Mark O'Donoghue, the regional biologist in Mayo for the Yukon government. Together, they're working on a proposal to protect the prime moose rearing grounds in the Mayo region. So in a sort of a three-line synopsis, give me an idea of what the proposal will say.
It will identify the most important areas for moose, and we'll talk about what the members of the community would like to see and would not like to see as far as human activities and developments in those areas.
What's special about the proposal is how it's being developed. Mark has counted on information gathered by Lawrence. He's been interviewing his people about what they know of moose behavior in the Stewart, McQuestion, and Mayo River valleys. Critical is the behavior observed during calving.
Over the past, if they were born there, they always return there. For some reason, if they get shot or killed by a wolf or something, then another cow would come in and it would take over that protected area for their own protection.
You know, the areas right along the river are where there's a lot of big trees, there's a lot of good soil and everything, so that there's always conflicts between wanting to have development there and the needs of the wildlife. So we're trying to identify the areas that are really, really important for the moose, and then when we get a proposal for a development there, we'll be able to say that, you know, this has a really important wildlife value, that we don't want to see development there. So I think there's a couple of different reasons why we'd want to get this sort of information.
Local traditional knowledge is being used to build a management decision for a population of moose. Western science has turned to a Yukon First Nation to help fill in the blanks about a particular wildlife group. Instead of just talking about traditional knowledge, the Yukon government is actually using it. The potential winners are the moose and the local community.
And depending on the needs of the wildlife and what the community wants, it could be anything from complete protection to you could do pretty much anything in there as long as the critical importance for the moose is maintained. So it will depend on what the community wants and what the needs of the moose actually are.
And if it's, you know, key habitat areas for protection, whether it's moose or fish, we're going to just have to explain it to them that it's, you know, it's going to be a process they're going to start using now for any kind of development, eh?
Yeah.
Traditional knowledge is going to have to be in there because modern science is good too. It has lots of good stuff in there, but when you're right out on the land, living on it, walking it, I think you can pick up a little bit more valuable stuff, eh?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, no matter how much you were to spend time here, and you know, if you put out a whole bunch of radio collars on cows and everything like that, you'd learn some things from it, but it wouldn't cover nearly the span of time or space that we'd need to get at to try and get this kind of information. And, you know, I think science is a good way of learning for some things, but there's the traditional knowledge just has that history there that you just wouldn't, you know, we just wouldn't get with any kind of a technical study you want to come up with.
It's called the 40-mile caribou herd. At the turn of the century, there were more than 500,000 animals. They range on each side of the Yukon-Alaska border. Today, it's a shadow of its former size. The herd has become a symbol for bringing science and traditional knowledge into the same arena. Biologists from 2 countries, Canada and the United States, plus First Nations on both sides of the border, and wildlife management boards are working together for the good of the caribou.
The First Nations people coexisted with them for many years, and there was ups and downs in the population that naturally occurred.
Rick Farnell is a caribou biologist with the Yukon government. He's one of the players hoping to expand the 40-mile caribou herd's numbers. It was probably one of the largest herds ever seen on the face of North America. But things changed when the caribou, unaware of the danger, began facing hunters' bullets.
And then crashed to 5,000. It's an unbelievable event. And a lot of that crash is attributed to the fact that there was incredible hunting intensity on the Top of the World Highway and the Taylor Highway over in Alaska. They used to advertise on the radio when the caribou were coming to the road.
There's still photographic evidence of the carnage that took place. By 1973, the herd rarely crossed back into the Yukon. Gone were the days in which people say it took the herd 10 days to cross the Yukon River.
I mentioned there's some pretty good potential for wildlife viewing areas.
Today, the management plan for the 40-mile caribou herd comes from those who knew the animals best, elders living on the land.
Our awareness of the magnitude and importance of the 40-mile herd as a component species to the central Yukon came from the oral history. This really was enlightenment. This really was a reason to try and restore the population, and really drove a lot of the decision making that subsequently happened.
The recovery plan is pretty straightforward. reduce hunting pressure. Only 150 bulls can be taken annually. Decrease grizzly bear and wolf predation on caribou calves. And protect and maintain the herd's habitat. The plan, it seems, is working.
And we actually got complete buy-in from the hunting community on this, and they said, okay, we will forego our harvest for the next 5 years in with respect to the caribou and see what we can develop. Well, boy, you know, human thinking really turned around. I mean, this being the first year of the recovery plan implementation, and the population has grown by 20% in the first year.
He's a bushman, a Tagish elder, and an activist of the quiet type. Art Johns brings to the Yukon Fish and Wildlife Management Board years of bush knowledge. His passion is for protecting the ecosystem that is the Southern Lakes region. An ideal that is approached through having respect for all living things.
Not like catch and release fishing. They don't fish out there to let it go and catch it again. Let it go and catch it again. You know, I guess it's fun for people, but for the native people, it's a way to survive. When you catch a fish, you bring it in, eat it.
Art has been intimately involved in rebuilding Yukon Southern Lakes caribou herds. For the past decade, he's worked alongside wildlife biologists. His way of living on the land may be confusing to others, but it's something he knows and trusts.
Traditional knowledge is hard to explain. You know, traditional knowledge is what it is, what you do, what you learn, the things that'll keep you going if science fails.
It's an aspect of traditional knowledge that's wisdom. These are people with long-term experience in lives living in ecosystems. They have a tremendous amount to offer. To me, it's cultural, traditional practice of employing traditional knowledge to management decision-making.
My mother cut meat and dry meat, and I help her. She teach me how to cut meat, all this thing. I'm still doing it.
Her name is Edith Josie, an elder from the Vantakwichin First Nation. She was just one of several elders who attended a traditional knowledge conference in Whitehorse.
So I wish that the people will leave the game alone.
It was Build Two Eyes, One Vision. Presented by the management board, they're trying to open up the public's awareness towards using more than science to manage wildlife.
You can do it the old way, where you make up a plan in a room with your scientific types and maybe a couple interest groups, and then pass the regulations and force it on people, but you don't have that community buy-in.
Linnea Workman is a member of the Champagne Aishihik First Nation. She's also their wildlife technician. She says traditional knowledge, if properly recorded and cataloged, would pinpoint declines in wildlife populations faster than standard scientific surveys. A couple of years ago, there was growing concern over dwindling moose in the Kluane and northern BC region. Linnea wound up doing a flying survey, but not until she had gathered local knowledge about where moose might be found.
We don't know where to go look to have this survey, so let's use this information. And we did, and I plotted all of the sightings of moose groupings.
When her survey results were put over a map drawn from talking to local elders and others, the result was uncanny.
I think I have it lined up properly. Okay, as you can see, it's pretty accurate, the information. Each one of those black dots represents a group of moose I saw over 400, well, just under 500 moose out there. And as you can see, just as an example, this blue line here is representing a migration corridor that one of the elders talked about. And everyone says truthing traditional knowledge. It's a bad word, but doing that, taking the Super Cub and going out and saying, okay, this is what we saw, this is what the local people said we'd see, I think it helped in making people understand and believing that local people do know what they're talking about and you can use that information.
Bob Hayes is the regional government biologist stationed in Haines Junction. He and Linnea have formed an excellent professional relationship.
And there's been quite a large decline in moose in this area since the 1980s. There were about 250 moose for every 1,000 square kilometers in this area.
We've worked together on a lot of controversial projects, and we've worked together hand in hand with the ALSAC Moose Management Plan again. I've learned a lot from Bob, as of quite a few of the other regional biologists, but he's a good man to have around.
They were brought to the Yukon in the 1950s by the Fish and Game Association. Elk are a transplanted species. The association wanted them to expand their hunting opportunities. Now the Yukon government looks after them. Locals have had to learn elk habits from scratch.
I'm hearing also, certainly among the staff, I'm not hearing why should we be doing this and questions around what is this. Those aren't the questions that are coming out anymore. The questions are really how can we do a better job of it.
Barney Smith works for the Yukon government in renewable resources. Sharing knowledge to manage fish and wildlife is for him a logical and efficient goal for governments to achieve.
The Council for Yukon First Nations has a really active program to the implementation side that is coordinating a bunch of work around traditional knowledge throughout all areas of the, all chapters of the final agreements. The Fish and Wildlife Management Board has set up a working group, and with the workshop that they had last April, they're really wanting to move ahead on coming up with some clear guidelines so they can help form some of their decisions and recommendations and what kind of information and knowledge they want to be brought forward when they consider ideas. And I think from our side, within the Fish and Wildlife branch, we're really looking at questions about how we can do a better job.
Acceptance of traditional knowledge as a key part of fish and wildlife management in the Yukon has had a slow and sometimes frustrating beginning. First Nations in the territory have always referred to it as a way of life.
Well, there's a mountain just outside of Haines Junction that I've been told for a number of years by the elders that they use for forecasting the weather. It's called Dry Lynx Mountain, and it's also known as Decoli Mountain, I believe. And simply how the clouds are forming on the mountain are what they use for forecasting the weather. And it seems to be far more effective than what we hear on CBC radio and coming from Environment Canada.
Still, the public may be caught up in defining traditional knowledge, but it's really not that hard to understand. Europeans have a long history of agriculture, and much of their knowledge has been placed in a farmer's almanac, a record of knowing how the earth and its seasons affects the growing of crops. The only difference is one culture has a written record, while the other has an oral tradition of handing down knowledge through the ages.
We've shown it so many times now that what traditional knowledge tells us tends to mimic exactly what we see in when we're flying and doing biological surveys. So setting up our problems, defining where we should be working. We don't need scientific information to do that, but we do need to work with communities and bring this two-vision, science and traditional knowledge, into seeing how we're going about management and how well we're doing with combining those two techniques, local traditional knowledge and science. I think it can work together quite well.
Today, special interest groups are saying it's time to move from recognition to practical use. And it looks like they're slowly winning the skeptics over. The Yukon government has directed its Renewable Resources Department to make better use of traditional knowledge in its day-to-day work.
I guess we're having an effect. in the sense that we provide those models, workable models, and some pretty clear instances of success that we can boast about, and we can confirm the truth of what people are saying, that utilizing the knowledge of people over thousands of years is a viable thing.
They're doing the same thing in Africa. There are groups of people going around to African communities interviewing African elders about how they manage their sheep and what they look for in terms of ecological relationships in order to better deal with their problems, you know, and they all encounter the same things. So I think if the element of hope is that very disparate cultures, such as the White Society and the First Nations Society, are coming together in a more honest and reasonable fashion, and that there will be a net benefit for everything in the long run.
The Yukon Fish and Wildlife Management Board is leading the change by doing rather than saying. Well, that's our show for this week. Thank you for watching. I'm Gordon Loverin. Be sure to tune in next week for some more of NDP, Your Eye on the Yukon, right here on APTN.